Story 1. Old sales job I had. Landed/closed a big deal with a nice commission check heading my way. Found out a week or so later that the client wasn't mine, therefore the check would be going to the correct sales rep. The correct sales rep just happened to be related to the boss, and so they got a free commission check without ever lifting a finger. Left that day. Story 2 Dillards. They told me to clock out and work all night because Regional was coming to inspect the store. So they wanted me to work for 8 hours moving around heavy stuff for free. Quit on the spot. Told me I wasn't a team player. I asked the manager if he would pay me for not working. He said no. I asked him why would I work without getting paid. Blank stare. Story 3. Over a decade ago, worked at Tim Hortons. Had been there 6 years on overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. We were always understaffed. Usually just 2 people, one in the back, one at front of house. Of course, it is slower than during the day, that goes without saying. But there are a few rushes when certain places close. Anyways, they hire back a guy who had previously been fired like 4 times for just not showing up. He was on the schedule on a Sunday morning with me. There was a 20-dozen donut order, and that was the day the freezer truck arrived, and I put that away. I remember saying if he doesn't show up, I'm probably just going home. Needless to say, he doesn't show up. Managers aren't picking up either. I think I stayed for a few hours futilely trying to get everything done. I closed down the front and the drive-through for what I intended to be a few hours to try to at least have the order ready for 6 a.m. But then a switch kind of flipped. I realized I wasn't going to be able to take any break the entire time. Somehow, I'd have to figure out how to put away a freezer delivery, which arrives literally at 5 a.m., which is busy as hell, and I'd be doing that as well. The people that showed up in the morning would just do their usual bitching about stuff I wasn't able to do. I'd probably get written up again for some stupid reason or because I didn't do X or Y or whatever, and all this for like $10.50 HR. I paused and asked myself, how long do I want to work here? And right then, a bunch of drunk kids were knocking on the door, apparently confused why the lights were off and the door was locked because that's an enigma. I decided 6 years is enough and went home. Story 4. My dad had cancer stage 4 lymphoma. We couldn't have our phones on the floor unless we filled out SONE paperwork with HR for emergencies. Asked my supervisor for the paperwork and he said, "Don't worry about it." Well, when his boss visited, he saw my phone and asked me about it, so I told the truth. My supervisor was pissed. A couple of weeks later, I get called into the HR office. My sister called to tell me my dad died. Supervisor wasn't there, but I left early. I took my bereavement and came back to work. My work bestie pulled me aside to tell me supervisor accused me of lying about my dad having cancer and dying to the entire team while I was gone. I hugged her and just left. Story 5. My dad died right before Christmas. I was already scheduled for a week off for family travel. HR said I could add 3 more days for funeral services so we could have it after the holiday. I came back and received a call from HR. The woman apologized and said she needed to ask but would make it brief. She asked if my dad actually died. I told her yes, and she apologized again and said she didn't need anything else. Then the office manager called me into her office to tell me my boss had been telling people she thought I was faking it to get more time off. My boss was horrible in general and relied on me to do the majority of her work, which is what led her to creating the story about my dad not actually dying. She was hoping I'd be called back early from my trip. I had been interviewing for a job at another company and got an offer the day I got back. I called from my desk and accepted the offer, then packed my things and left. Story 6. I is working at Sears part-time for Christmas. They never trained me. When my supervisor came in for something and found out I was working alone, he ran out before they could ask him to help. My other supervisor had a nervous breakdown and, while crying, said he wanted to punch the manager but was a felon and needed the job. I just got tired of the shit because I was literally just working for Christmas money. They found me at my other job and asked me to come back because I had figured out how to do the job without being trained. I said no, and they told me I'd never be able to work for Sears or Kmart again. Shiver me timbers. Story 7. They never gave me the raise they promised me 3 months before. Then a manager tried to criticize me for not doing something that wasn't even my responsibility. I cursed him out, then cursed the main plant manager out in our meeting, and left. About 3 days later, the plant manager called and asked why I haven't been to work. He thought I was just venting and left for the day. I told him I said I fucking quit. No sure how that wasn't clear. Story 8. I've only quit one job ever, in high school when I worked at a grocery store. But I quit after I somehow was the only person scheduled to work on a Saturday night. Like literally the only person. I was 16 or 17. Granted, I lived in a small town, but being the only person working in a whole-ass grocery store, to emphasize only person. Not a single other person was working. Not a janitor, not a manager, not a bag boy, no one else. Was just absurd. Never went back. Story 9. Did everything they wanted, jumped on a plane to another site on 1 day's notice, ended up working 16 days straight before coming back. Took a WFH customer service job role I didn't really want just to help out on a temporary basis. We were told that half the team could have Christmas Eve and Christmas Day off, and the other half could have Christmas Day and Boxing Day. Except me, who could only have Christmas Day. I signed out of the VPN, call-blocked my managers, put my laptop in a box, and posted it to head office with my resignation letter inside it. Story 10. I once worked as a landscaper, and during a slow month, some of us workers were asked to head to the boss's brother's property and help out there, which was fine. My boss asked that I pick him up in the morning and take him out there. The straw that broke the camel's back was while out there I had filled some buckets with water, and while I did turn the tap off, it was slowly dripping. My boss noticed this and had a complete meltdown. He made threats to harm to the person who left it dripping. He didn't know who it was at that point. I dropped my tools, told my boss to shove his threats, and left, leaving my boss in the middle of nowhere. Story 11. Heard my boss talking about my mom, who did not work for the company, on the phone to HR while at work. She said my mom was a nut job, and went on to lie about how she had plans to replace me for the last few weeks. She was deeply paranoid, and earlier that week she'd gotten wind that I was looking for a second job closer to home, which caused us to have a long talk where I kept having to reassure her I had no plans to quit, but just her assuming I would quit had made her turn on me like that after 6 years of working together, including multiple major work events, like COVID. So somehow she went from begging me not to leave, to the next day telling HR she had plans to fire me for weeks. But it was what she said about my mom during that same call that broke the camel's back. My mom was in deep grieving at the time, having found her boyfriend dead on the floor on her birthday, and I had confided in my boss that I was spending a lot of energy trying to help my mom and that it was causing me stress. As soon as I heard her say that, I packed up my desk, walked over to HR and told them everything I'd heard and quit when they said they didn't have any other positions open elsewhere in the company, and said they wouldn't take action against my boss. Story 12. When I got called an hour before my shift and was told to come in immediately because the manager didn't schedule enough people. When I reminded her I needed to bus, I was told to just take a cab. Stupidly, I did. And when I got in, she told me I should have made sure she did the schedule right. Then I was told I'd be opening the next morning, even though I was closing the kitchen that night. I closed. I did not open. My apron and key were on the counter waiting for her when she went to work in the morning. Story 13. New boss completely changed hours, expectations without any notice or checking in with any employees. I got the worst of it. And when I stood up for myself, I was greeted with anything between crocodile tears to just full-on insults. After 3 months of being miserable, I walked after one final scathing insult. I regret the lack of professionalism on my end, but I don't regret leaving the job. Story 14. I was a shift lead in a kitchen where none of the management knew anything about BOH. I ran grill, sauté, expo, and ovens solo during every peak shift. I ordered trucks, prepped all week for weekend brunch, wrote kitchen schedules, coordinated kitchen cleaning projects, contacted vendors for repairs, and generally ran the kitchens day to day. I was given the keys and started opening 6 days a week. I was working 55+ hours and loving it. I expanded our brunch service to Fridays as well as Saturday, Sunday, and I come up with an early week menu to use up leftover brunch items and minimize waste. I helped grow weekly sales from 45K to 80K in 3 years. I started having issues with closing management on shifts where I wasn't there. I'd get in at 6 a.m. to open, and the restaurant was left a mess, and prep stocking wasn't completed. I talked to the staff and tried to get them to help out, but I had no support and follow through from the actual managers. This went on for weeks. Then one week I was in at 5 for Friday brunch prep. I was prepping sheets of bacon and went to the back to pull the biscuits I had prepped the day before. I had left them on a speed rack. I found them on a shelf, stacked on top of each other. The weight of the trays had smashed every biscuit into single sheets of dough on the lower trays. The speed rack had the dressings and cold items from the line close the night before. I did about 90% of the brunch prep by the time the opening manager showed up at 8:30. We opened at 9. I told her what was left to set up the line. She asked why I was telling her. I laid the sheets of dough in front of her, dropped my keys on top, and walked out. I got nearly 50 calls from them that day and dozens of texts. I didn't respond to a single one. A few days later, the owner of the store called me and asked who he needed to fire to bring me back. I told him I'd pass and ended up finding another job in a day. A little over a year later, this restaurant shut down and was demolished to turn the space into a parking garage. Story 15. After 18 years in retail, I took a vacation to the beach. It had been an ungodly tough year of death, becoming a widow, trouble with my children, money problems, and a boss with an otherworldly hatred of me suddenly having much more things taking up my time. They were completely unwilling to be flexible with these new constraints on my time, so I finally just wrote a schedule and took a whopping 3 days to myself. I finally felt relaxed and realized I felt so good to be so far away. The day I was supposed to pack and head home, I extended mine and my kiddos' stays and just never went back. They called like crazy, texted, tried to get a hold of me, but I didn't care. I stayed gone and it was like a weight was lifted. I still have nightmares about that place, but at least I wake up knowing I never have to go there again. Story 16. I worked a contract writing gig for hire at a tech company coming out of college. I thought that was where you started, so I worked my ass off writing copy all day for these idiotic scripts. One day the boss comes up to the 5 writers and says, "Yeah, we only usually keep one of you," and then said, "I wonder who it will be, That moment showed how little they valued mine and my coworkers' creative. It also showed me how little they valued me. I ended up deleting my browser history, closing my laptop, and walking out. The biggest mistake was that I had to bring the fob back the next week. My dumbass forgot to take it off, so I solid-snaked it back into the office at 6 a.m. because I knew it would just be the janitorial staff. Story 17. VP of company took me aside and showed me how my skills in maintenance had saved the company about $15,000 in my first year there. Along with that, I volunteered for our department's safety officer as soon as I got there and was always taking the shit jobs nobody wanted. I asked for a raise and got the runaround and told I wasn't worth it. I put in a week's notice and moved. Now I'm making over 2x as much and way happier and appreciated for my work with less hours. I wish daily that place goes bankrupt. A blind kid could manage coloring a photorealistic painting with his big toe before that place had proper management. Story 18 was a shift supervisor at Wendy's. One night, a customer ordered an apple pecan salad after we had sold our last pre-made one. I asked an employee to gather ingredients from the walk-in fridge, specifically a bag of pre-chopped apples. He brought me 2 bags. One contained browned apple and had an expired expiration date label. The other looked fresh and wasn't expired. I thanked him, took the fresh one, and instructed him to dispose of the expired one. He refused because he was afraid my boss would find out it was him and fire him. I said, "She can't fire you for doing what I told you to do, especially if it's the right thing to do." The next day, I get a call from an underage employee asking for a ride to work. When I picked him up, I suddenly remembered that he wasn't on the schedule and asked him why he was going on. He explained that the boss had asked him to sub for someone she fired. We arrive at work, and I walk straight back to the office to check the schedule and see that she's crossed out the employee name who threw out the apples. I asked my boss why his name was crossed off the schedule, and she said he was wasting perfectly good food. I told her that I told him to throw it away because it was brown and the stamped date was expired. She yelled back that it was only a few days past expiration, and it was still fine. I explained that it is illegal to sell food beyond its expiration date, but if she wanted to eat it herself, she was welcome to get it out of the dumpster. She said she did get it out of the dumpster and made salads with it. Then she yelled, "You don't throw away milk just because the expiration date has passed without sniffing it first." I yelled back, "First of all, the apples were fucking brown, and second of all, I absolutely will throw out expired milk without sniffing it because spoiled milk smells awful, and I don't want to ruin my appetite while I'm serving myself a meal." Then she threatened to fire me, and I yelled that she should because I was the one who instructed the employee to dispose of expired food, and I'll do it again. She admitted it was an empty promise because she couldn't afford to fire me, so I told her I was quitting. She asked, "Right now?" I said, "No, I'm giving my 2-week notice, but I start my 2-week vacation tomorrow, so tonight is my last shift." Later that night, I called the fired employee and apologized for getting him fired and bragged about how I quit in solidarity. When my 2 weeks vacation was up, I actually did have to work 1 more week in order to get paid for my 2-week vacation, because I needed 1 more week to qualify working a full year. During that final week, I had an exit interview with the district manager. I explained why I quit and spoiled the beans on a bunch of other shit the boss did wrong, and also suggested she get the security camera system fixed without the manager knowing, because the manager's shift is constantly putting money in the register and handing food out of the window without ringing it up in the system. Then the manager counts out the drawers, which is against policy, and pockets the excess cash. During my next shift, a couple of tech guys from corporate showed up to fix the security camera DVR, but left the second they opened the closet and saw we had a VHS system. They couldn't just fix it. They needed to replace it. Also, they were very confused as to why we had a VHS system, considering how new our store was. I told them the rumor was that the manager swapped it with a system from her house so she could get away with they. Anyways, the district manager asked me to work at a store that was closer to my house for 1 month, because all of the managers at the other store were overdue for vacations, but they didn't have enough managers to take vacations. When I started working at the other Wendy's, I explained to the general manager why I quit and got transferred, and that I'd quit with no notice if he overruled my decisions on food safety. He agreed. I worked there for almost a month and never had a single shift where I was the only manager on duty, which either meant that they did have enough managers to take vacations, or they weren't taking any vacations anyway. Then, one day, an employee grabbed a bag of frozen chicken out of a freezer, unaware that it was already open, and dumped the whole bag of frozen chicken on the floor right in front of the general manager and I. The employee looked at us both, shrugged, and asked, "5-second rule?" I replied, "No. The 5-second rule works if your only concern is vilification contamination, which can be cooked off, but we clean the floors with toxic chemicals that cannot be cooked off. If you serve that chicken to customers, you will poison them." The employee looked at the general manager for confirmation, but the general manager said, "He's right, but that's a whole lot of money. Pick it up and serve it." I walked out while saying, "Good luck with the food poisoning lawsuits," loud enough for customers to hear.